while Marianna Dixon Williams is talking, because they have much more interesting things to say than I do. I'm really excited to have you here. Marianna Dixon is an assistant professor of digital art at Mount Holyoke College and was previously an assistant professor of new media at Augusta University in Georgia. Marianna Dixon builds handmade electronic objects and constructed environments which question how we see the natural world and the ability for this world to be simulated, emulated, and measured digitally. They've exhibited extensively throughout the United States and Europe and have completed studio projects in sites ranging from the Arctic Circle to the American desert. I could go on to praise Marianna Dixon's work and productivity and prolificness, but I think after the presentation here, you won't need me to explain it to you. Before we start, at least for my class, but hopefully for everyone here, I want to point out that UNH is a research university. And hearing that word research, an art major might have the impulse to say like, well, like that's fine for the rest of the university, but like here in the fine art department, we're safe from that word research. And there's some strange conditioning that must have happened like in junior high school that gave us this idea that research is somehow antithetical to the idea of creative freedom or the creative process. Now, if we introduce the word experimental, everybody's blood pressure goes down. We're like, that's cool, like I know how to do that. I know how to talk about work that way. But experimentation and research are baked in the cake together. As artists, you have the permission to change the methodology and change the ways that we approach the idea of what a research process looks like. It can be a support system for your curiosity. And more importantly, a creative research framework can provide the energy and urgency that's needed to sustain a practice in the long term. So by inviting Marianna Dixon here to present their work, I hope you'll gain some appreciation for this idea that research is just as relevant and essential to an art practice as any other field. So
Thank you. Thank you, Shanna. Yeah. I just want to say thank you so much. Shanna's been a dear friend for a long time, and fellow artist I deeply respect. Also, I'm so honored to be here. It's really cool to see you all, and thank you for taking the time to look at this work. I just wanted to start and frame the talk based on my approach to creative research and sort of process-driven work in the studio. So I really want to take this as like almost like how I'm thinking about images, why I'm making the images I'm making, what's at stake in it, and like I want to start. This is a piece from actually my undergrad. Shannon and I were both at RISD, but not at the same time. But when I was at RISD, I started getting interested in media. But I was a painting major. I grew up in the South. Go ahead and start. Just get it going. So I grew up in Georgia, and when I went to art school, it was like this very like I went into painting. I was like, well, okay. I had this real love of old paintings, this real love of drawing, and for me, painting was this sort of space where I could talk about these like subconscious or like inner things, sort of talk about the quality of like life or like what it means to be. How do we see ourselves as people? How do we see ourselves as in the world? And I started thinking about painting as like, okay, the painting is something that meets us halfway. Where we're supposed to make something with an idea in it and then put it out in the world, put it on the wall. Someone comes to the painting's meeting is halfway, and then their reaction starts to happen. But through that process, I was thinking, well, I got a little bit frustrated. I was like, well, it's still, I read Michael Fried's Art and Objecthood, and then I also started taking these other classes and thinking about media and thinking about cinema and early cinema in particular, and thinking about, well, how are we measuring the world? How are we looking at the world around us? At the same time, I joined the cycling team, and I got super into it, and I was like horribly afraid of crashing, and I was like, oh my gosh, how do I talk about my massive fear of dying on this bicycle, but also I love this sport and I can't stop doing it, and like, you know, I was like, I can't make a painting about it. I tried to make this, like the gravel or like the cement of the road out of like latex and pigment, and then I tried to also photocopy the road and take rubbings of it and then put that into like an acrylic matte medium and make this giant tapestry of the road, and it all just fell apart, and I was like, this isn't working. So I started looking at this stock footage and on-camera footage and footage from races, one to learn how to race, and another to kind of think about, well, how can I avoid this? And in this piece, you know, I was like, well, if it's something that's happening over time, maybe I need to start sketching in a material that is more closely related to the thing I'm doing, or that's more closely related to like my final output. So the idea for me was like, well, I'll just erase the bikes, and then it'll be like they're dancing, you know? They won't be like falling on their heads. They'll just be breakdancing, you know? And then this generator, actually, I had a buddy named Gator, who is like this old, you know, one of my, you know, family friends from Georgia, and he was a welder, and I was like, Gator, I got this car alternator, and I heard that if you hook some batteries up to it, you can make a generator out of it. And the whole idea was that if someone would pedal the bike, they would have to be forcing the animations, like, it won't run unless you're pedaling, basically. So I was like, in a sense, I was thinking like, you know, even though this is like so not related to the stuff I'm doing now visually, on a conceptual level, the process was so important to me, because it was like, we need somebody to activate the work, we need participation, we also need a format that's gonna show it, so it's like an embodied thing. And then also by erasing, I was like, well, we have to play. You know, sometimes when we're playing with something, it creates this like, you know, this different openness to learning, this different openness to like understanding and experience. So I started to have this like kind of crisis in the studio where I'm like, I can't make pictures anymore, because what does it mean? And like, oh my gosh, like, is this like an index of the world? Is this like kind of a representation of the world? Like, I don't know, is it, I got in this big crisis. So I got super interested in like a lot of the video artists and sort of performance artists in the 70s, and a lot of documentary practices. At the same time, I think, you know, we're always kind of trying to figure out like, well, who am I, you know, and how do I define myself as a person, as a human in this world? You know, I came from like a very small place, so when I went to art school and was in Providence and kind of exposed to all these new ideas and practices, I was not only learning about like the nature of my tools, but I was learning about like who I was as a person. And I think, you know, I guess there were some things in there that I was like, well, I don't think I was really ready to look at a lot of those sort of issues of soul at 20, 21, that sort of thing. So I was like, well, everybody likes trees, everyone likes the environment, maybe I'll talk about that, you know, and maybe I'll document everything in the world around me to try to like understand it better, you know. So this is actually a building in an abandoned coal mining settlement in Pyramiden, Russia. Pyramiden is, I guess it was purchased, it's a territory on like north of Svalbard, north of Spitsbergen, which is like north of Norway. It's kind of Norwegian international territory. And it's purchased, Russia purchased these territories from Sweden in 1927 for coal mining. And the population grew up to like 3,000 or 4,000 people in the 80s up to the 90s. And then these settlements were abandoned, sort of tragically. What happened in this site, though, all of the structures and all of the, this is actually like family dormitories, and there's oil rigs and this kind of different things like that. But when it was abandoned, the story had it that there was a plane that was on the other side of the sort of this like right past that kind of mountain area. there's a plane that's crash landed from Longyearbyen up here, and a lot of the people who lived in the settlement, their families, like the guys who were working it, they all kind of passed away, like quite suddenly. And so I think there was this like, at that time the population was declining, and I think they just sort of let it go, and so when I went there, you walk into the buildings and there's still the furniture, there's a sports complex, there's pools and musical instruments they had like a fake Olympic thing with like documentation of the communities there. But it's kind of interesting to walk into this place that was like frozen in time. At the time I was up in the Arctic because I was trying to think about, how I could reframe the environment, how we could think about like climate and about these environmental issues. At the time, climate's just starting to become on my radar. Like, growing up in Georgia, I was always like familiar with the land, but more in like an agricultural sense, and I think, when I was in college, I started to see like, well, how do our actions impact the world around us? How do our small choices, like on the local level, how can those impact production systems? And, part of my reason for being up here was to document and sort of take footage from the glaciers, from, up top. I'll get to it in a bit. Flew a kite camera around the space from the boat to sort of figure out, well, how can I measure and take a picture of this space? And we happened to be passing through, and we stopped in Pyramiden, and spent some time and talks. And there's a lot of, I think like there's something about when you're exploring. At the time, I was just trying to like take a huge picture of the world. I think I was 23 at this time, just out of my undergrad. I had a camera. I had gotten this grant to sort of look at the environmental topics, and then along that journey, ran into this community where there's this deep, deep loss, and where these much larger socio-political implications to documenting, like who has a voice in this footage, who doesn't, what are we doing, like what's happening on a larger global scale, these things I wasn't even aware of. So sometimes I just point this out just to say, sometimes when we're walking into a space with a camera, with something that can measure the world, take the world back in, we also have this responsibility in our editing and in our presentation of it to talk about like, well, what's at stake in that image, or like whose rights are, is this supporting rights for someone or not, or is this supporting, I think about this now when I'm teaching, we're designing a lot of sculptural interventions for the environment. And like, is this hurting the existing environment? Is this plan, or is it helping it? Or is this driven through the community, or is it not? These kinds of questions. I guess I want to show in this way, like the jumping to different places, because I think when we're starting our creative life, it's okay to seek out and search a lot of different areas, and to try to like, we had a friend says, you're only really interested in a couple things sometimes. You think you have all these major interests, and I'm out there and I'm like, I'm gonna document the whole world and anything that comes my way. But I realized the real issue there, and the reason why I keep searching and looking at this, there are these things that I wasn't really ready to talk about, these metaphors for growth and loss in ourselves, and how we know ourselves, and maybe the journeys that we're taking to find ourselves. And sometimes you might take an image and you don't realize how much that image later can be a metaphor for something else. So I guess my point with this is take it all in, keep it and document it, back it up 3 different ways on multiple formats, multiple hard drives, online, offline, because later you might be able to look back at it and it'll help you out. So the grant that I wrote, the reason why I ended up in the Arctic out of this painting program, by the way, I wanted to, from that painting program, I'm like, well, I'm having this object crisis, and I'm just like, okay, I'm making images, but they need to mean something, and maybe they need to be an index or evidence of something in the way that smoke is an index of fire, And so I was like, well, I'm gonna go around to these glaciers, and I'm gonna take contact microphones, which are these mics that record the interior, it's like the surface of the object and the reverberations within, not just the air surrounding it. So it was like really important to me that the material is connected to the tool. Starting to build this interest in different tools and building technologies that help us see things that we couldn't otherwise see. And I was like, well, I'll record these, and then I'm going to take those sine waves. So where I started getting into programming as well, because I was like, well, I'm gonna have to create, these are paper test discs, and these are some like plastic discs. I was gonna see if you can use a program called, at the time I was using Processing, which is an open source programming language for artists written by Casey Reese and Ben Fry at MIT. They're sort of writing this language where it's like, well, code is just another way of seeing the world, another way of representing the world. As someone with no background in it, it was really accessible for me because, like, for example, the word rectangle is erect, or like ellipse is ellipse, or a point is a point in that language, So it was kind of like just understanding the grammar of it, the syntax. And then I did a little research into, Python, which is all online, pretty open source, pretty easy to find, and was able to patch these things together, not having really, I think the internet was really helpful for me in like getting started with tech, and publishing work that was more experimental online, because, it was like, well, I can convert the sound file into XYZ coordinate, as a line. If you really think about how a record's built, it's, you could have a record, and if you strung that line from the needle, it could like run the length of a football field. The only reason why it's a circle is to kind of conserve the space, so we're actually like spinning towards the center. So you have this sort of like inward motion or outward motion thing. And I was like, all right, this is gonna work. So I got, in our studios, I laser cut this sort of like depth into the paper, and it's like thick watercolor paper, like tried it on Bristol board, tried on lots of different surfaces, and then looked back at these early like sonic technologies, actually looking at phonautograms specifically, which is like an early invention where smoke passes across a surface, and then you're able to measure a sound wave visually. So looking back in time, seeing how other people had represented and sort of translated information from one sense to another, that became like another big cue. I'm like, well, how do we not only sense things that we can't see otherwise, but how do we think about, okay, what if I heard it, but then it's visual, or what if it's visual and then I heard it, Like, what is it about this translation, not only between materials, but between like our systems and our own bodies, and our own way of orienting to the world. So I was like, all right, I got this. I actually was kind of comical. I got like a megaphone and a sewing needle, and I got like a little, servo, and I was like, I'm gonna play this thing. And I made this like very faint, like very like rough sound, but it made sound. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's like totally works. I wasted a whole year of grad school on this, Once it worked, I kind of was like, well, it's really important for me that these recordings are layered, that I'm not editing them too much, and play you some of that sound now. Oh yeah, I'm actually muted, sorry. me, it became really important that I wasn't actually editing the sound like an audio program, that I was just directly layering the sound that was an index or specifically taken from that site in the Arctic in 2013. And for me, there's a whole conversation around field recordings and editing, and the sound community has opinions, and there's lots of different things. If you're interested, you can go into about it, but it's almost like in the sense that like if you have a piece of performance art, you know, is the performance and the performance itself, is in the documentation of it, does the artist want the thing documented at all? Is it in the writing of it? Again, looking back to those earlier references and thinking about my family tree of making and sort of how that's affecting the decisions that I'm making as well. You know, we're not working within a vacuum, or for me at least, I don't. So I've made these 500 discs, and then I stacked them up in the gallery, and I was like, take it, you know, with the idea that if someone took that and they played it in their house, let's say in Atlanta, then, you know, they're looking at a piece of the Arctic that's a direct recording, it's an index of that space, and that disc, the paper discs destroy themselves pretty quickly when you play them. These discs also erode, you know, so the idea that you have this memory, the memory is always changing, the way that we recall something, the way that we're looking back at our lives, we're looking at telling a story is changing a little bit each time. The Arctic's also changing, our environment's changing. So thinking about these patterns of growth, these patterns of loss, and then having something that materially represents that. It's not just about a representation or an illustration of it, but something that, like, here's a physical record of this thing, I want you to consider it, and these 500 discs live 500 different lives all around the world. And it's really important as well for me, because I was like, you know, everyone should have access to this. This shouldn't be this, like, you know, I think sometimes one of my frustrations with contemporary art and with galleries is that they're like this own little world, you know? And we were talking about this earlier. It was like, how can I love something so much and then spend years focusing on it? And then I tell my mom, and she's like, oh, honey, like, you know, and like, my family, you know, it's kind of like, I think it's really fascinating, you know, that we kind of get in these little subcultures, and, you know, it's interesting. We were talking a little bit earlier, you know, when you're finding your way, I think it's really good in creative research to try lots of different strategies. So I was like, okay, I covered sound for now, get back to it later, I'm sure, in my practice. This is actually an Ocean Spray cranberry juice bin, stick right there. That is a drawing made in the boat. We were talking about the zip ties that I found in the kitchen, and this is a meteorological kite, because I was just before drones, you know, and you know, helium doesn't float in really cold temperatures, knew enough about that, so I spent the entire summer before this in a field, in a soccer field, behind my house, like, flying this kite, and like, learning to fly the kite, and the meteorological kite is like, I mean, they're like 7 feet wide, you know, it lifts this early GoPro up. I got a waterproof case for it because they weren't yet like waterproof, you know, zip tie that thing to the kite, and I was like, I got this. I get to the boat, and the boat's only like 60 feet long, and it's a sailboat, so like, you know, it's a barkentine, so there's like masts and stuff, and we're like pulling ropes, and I realized I can only run like 5 feet across the boat, and then the captain told us when we got there that if we fell in, we had like 1 minute to be rescued or we died. So like, I was like, okay. So we tied me to a rope to the boat, and I think I was in the Arctic for like a couple months, you know? And I spent like 3 or 4 weeks of that, like running around with a rope around my waist, you know, trying to get this camera in the air. I was like, you know, like the Wright brothers over here, you know, I was like, and everyone's like, did you get it up today? And I was like, no, you know, and like, but then we hit this, like, you know, the Arctic has these like amazing optical phenomena and these amazing gusts of wind and these amazing sort of natural features. So we hit this like really gusty day, and I was like, we got this, you know. So we had a team of people up there and got this thing in the air, and it flew for like a minute, you know. And then the kite, the mainstay of that kite, it broke. Like, there's a little beam that, like a carbon beam that goes across the width of that. it snapped completely in half. And the kite's up there in this like bubble, like in this sort of, I mean, it's like suspended in air. And I was like, oh my gosh, I spent 4 weeks getting this kite up there and now I can't get it down. And we're like on the side of the boat, like shooting flares at it and, you know, all this stuff. And you know, the thing finally crashes. This is the boat before, there's the flare, you know, talking about performance and whatnot. Does it count as performance if it's a photograph? Maybe I'll let you think about it. So when you're thinking about, this is some of that footage from that kite, from the first launch of the kite. You know, I think about, there's something about like when we're thinking about, you know, everything's not very practiced, and I think about, well, you know, making these installations which reframe how we see ourselves in our environment, thinking about, you know, water is a central metaphor to think about. Water has like a constant identity, right? But it's just shaped depending on the container that it's in. It's like kind of a flexible material in that way. Thinking about maybe like in a weird way, I feel like I've kind of done that a little bit in my life. It's like, okay, I know who I am, but also these journeys that we take and the experiences that we have in our lives, they change us, you know? We learn things about the world. This is actually, okay, this one right here. So this is from the kite. This one is that footage taken back into a frame in Photoshop. You can sort of reinterpret the footage with a little bit of code. Not too complicated, but I wrote a script to glitch some of the pixels in it. And again, you know, thinking about how do we have these images? For me, a lot of my this is terrible to say, but I feel like a lot of my work like kind of eats itself up and then it spits it back out as something else. But as a way, because I understand how this is working, so maybe I can adjust it, you know, and try something new. And then the edges on the side, my sequence only repeated it so far, like maybe only like 2/3 of the screen. So everything on the outside edge is actually hand drawn, like photorealistically. In a way. So, you know, I got like 140 drawings into this and I was like, I'm done. It took me like too long. I was like, this is cool but not sustainable for me and my carpal tunnel. That's not happened yet, you know. But also thinking about like, you know, layering and printing, and still thinking about these issues in painting, you know, about the surface and about, you know, how we're seeing things. I think there's things I was like really holding on to, and I was like, well, I need to still make these things for it to be art, you know, and I'm realizing that it's all kind of there. This is actually some footage taken from 8 GoPros. I got smart and just went up the mast and zip tied those guys directly to the boat, and then in post stitched them together, so you can see kind of like how the boat was moving. And I really liked, you know, as the icebreakers kind of like shooting through the ice, I'm like, all right, you know, that's something. But in a way, I felt like I was still thinking about these, I was kind of MacGyvering or like kind of inventing these ways to see things that I couldn't otherwise see. And it was really important for me to use technology and to use cameras and these sort of like very old tech things, you know, and to show the feedback loops, to show like, okay, well, this is how I got it. It's still very manageable for me, you know, like I don't have any technical background, like, you know, some people in my family are engineers, but like, they're also like working wood shops and, you know, not artists at all. So for me, I was like, not really thinking about what does this image mean? What's at stake in this image? Like, you know, I was like, isn't it cool that we can see the Arctic in this way, and that we, you know, isn't it cool that it makes that cool warpy thing, you know? This Arctic is changing so much, you know, and most people will be like, wow, yeah, it's an issue that, you know, I think is like affecting our lives, but doesn't affect us on a personal level in the short term. So yeah, you know, it's good to call that out. But you know, I think if you keep working with something long enough, and I go back to what I was thinking about in the beginning, like, you know, we think we're interested in a few things. I'm still here making work about the Arctic, thinking I'm like hot shit, and then I realize I'm still not addressing those questions that I'm avoiding in the beginning. Like, I'm not really thinking about like, what does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be human? Why am I making this work? Why am I thinking about loss? Why am I thinking about growth? Why am I thinking about sort of like growing up in these places and like this longing for like wanting to be, to find this sense of home or to find this sense of place, but to not ever go back, you know, why am I thinking about it? I need to go look outside of myself a little bit more, play with projections, learn all about this tech, make it this beautiful surface thing, as a way for me, thinking about, you know, having some really genuine, like really like thoughtful moments where I'm like, okay, like thinking about a piece like this is the side of from Los Angeles from our thesis show, I think. Thinking about, okay, this is about 20 feet tall. It's an airplane hangar. It's just like the dimensions of the hull of the ship. You know, I'm thinking about if I build a structure. In my mind, I thought I was going to build half a boat and then project the horizon onto it and sort of like integrate the sculptural element with this video element. What really happened is I made my like 10-year-old skateboarder dreams come true, and I made this like amazing half pipe, but it wasn't structurally sound for skating, but very structurally sound for a screen. I think like from there, you know, going out of grad school, collaborating with architects, thinking about this is a space for a site. It's a proposal that I worked with an architect, Moya-san. We worked together for several years after grad school. We kept each other going a little bit through applying to these architecture competitions. And it was kind of this nice way to continue to simulate critique and to simulate creative research in a way that kept me going outside of a formal academic setting. You know, I was, at the time, after grad school, I went to the Arctic. I worked for an advertising firm for a while. I was racing bikes at an elite level. You know, it wasn't really, I was getting into cyclocross. I was getting into mountain biking. I was working at a bike shop actually too. Started teaching, you know, after this. But I think it was always important for me to think like, well, you know, maybe I'll keep seeking. If I don't have the answer right now, if I keep making work, if I keep thinking about, you know, the importance of the visual, of communication and like sort of meeting someone, you know, when I talked about the paintings meeting us halfway, I'm like, well, images I think are this way of like connecting to the world, you know, even if I don't fully understand it. There's a way of thinking about the world with our hands, thinking materially, you know. So I was like, well, Moya and I designed this, these are interactive animation galleries that live in the house of a, basically, if I show you, I think I show you here, yeah. So these are a different bus route along the path of a city, and each of these animation terminals we use an infrared sensor that we hacked out of, I had a bunch of Kinect controllers for my Xbox, and it became outdated, but with the processing code, the same thing that allowed me to translate the sound into the laser cut record, I was able to think about taking the Xbox controller, using open source code that was already out there, updating it a little bit with a bit of research over several weeks, and then creating these spaces that would actually, they scan your body back into the space. I'll show a clip from how that works in a minute. And the idea is that each of these animation terminals, when they're activated, they would not only scan your body and put you back in the animation space, but it would talk a little bit about the history and like one part of the narrative of that city. And then you'd have to go to all 8 bus terminals to hear the whole thing. So the idea is it would get people who weren't, normally in one part of the city to try to get them into another, or to talk about the history of the city in terms of this water narrative, thinking about the environmental and sustainability issues in that program. We did another kind of bonkers thing about a sound-activated walk where you would go and you would hike around, and in this area, I'll kind of buzz by this a minute, but I had gone out in Georgia. I was living there at the time. I was teaching at Augusta University, and I was really into hiking with my dog. So I was like, okay, it's like during the pandemic, I think, started it. And I was like, you'll walk by any number of these little bollards, I guess would be the correct term for it, these little pulse cylinders, and they would activate the soundscape, and then it would play inside this disco ball inside this museum. Inside, so there's like interior and exterior relationship that was bringing like the natural world back into the disco ball, and you could go to the disco ball and like dance and play around with it, but then you would never actually really hear your sound trigger, so it was this whole kind of like, did a tree fall in the forest? I don't know, as a piece. Moyer really wanted to make this sort of like a conductive glass. It's a material, this is a sketch we didn't propose, this is part of it, but the idea that like the glass would change color to reflect what was happening with the sound as well. You can have electronics in glass. This is like quick animation in After Effects. So talking about, scanning with the Connect. This is the source code. If anyone wants it, happy to share it. Happy to give it to you. If you can get a Connect on eBay, you can use it. The idea is that you can interpret, this is me when I had long hair, you can interpret an image and play with that pixel. I was really interested still in this sort of like painterly, like surface representation of things, and I decided that it would be even cooler if I built this space out. These are all built from letters. I've been traveling around, like not talking it, like kind of making work about things, trying to find my orientation towards the world. I'm also at this time like just coming out. Like I think it was sort of this time I was trying to define who I was as a person and how I see the world. So these are letters that I kept with me that were written, they're abstracted obviously, I think there's something about coding and privacy that I was interested in as well. But thinking about, I was thinking, how do we define home? Is it in our relationships? What happens, what happens if we lose our stories? How do we know ourselves? And we talked really close with my grandmother. We write a lot of letters back and forth to each other, and airplane napkins, and I layered all these together in Photoshop, basically these handwritten things, notes that I had written to myself about, journaling became this really like meditative, really helpful thing for me in studio. Not only to document like, okay, if I write about what I did in studio every day, then maybe it won't feel so lost. Maybe I'll see patterns in that. Maybe there'll be something in that I can look back and be like, oh yeah, I was thinking about that today. I really did something today. As opposed to making like media art that is really ephemeral, that doesn't have like a big material structure, and then being like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? It's quite disorienting if you don't have a map. So at this point, I'm like, letters was a piece for me. It's in 2019 where I'm really finally starting to think about, okay, I'm not going to look outward anymore. I'm going to look inward, and I'm going to say, like, well, who am I as a person? I need to know myself if I'm going to make real art, if I'm going to have anything to say, And I think I was this moment where I was like, a lot of things were kind of falling apart in my life at the time, and I was having to like build it back up. And I was, I was still teaching. I was in a tenure track job at that time. I was, a lot of things were like quickly moving, but with each phase of our life, I was like, okay, like, it seemed like life made me sit and reflect a bit more. And then the work, when I opened up and I was okay with being a little bit more vulnerable about that, it really gave me a lot of answers to some of those new questions, honestly. So these are like, I was like, well, if I share these letters, these relationships are the ways that I define home. If I'm thinking about family as sort of like the people that will fight for us, or like, the people we would also fight for, I was like, well, I'll take that connects data, and then just in the top corner here, right here, this little sensor here. Actually, if you walk into the space, this is about 16 feet long, 8 feet tall. And you can move these are steel orbs you can move around on the floor. There's magnets underneath the floor, really, really strong magnets. So if you push the ball around, it always re-centers to home. So no matter where you play or where you push it, it's always kind of finding its balance, finding its center point, balance point. for me, I was like getting into meditation. I was like, I didn't sustain that practice, but at the time I was like, this is awesome, you know, I'm centering. And then the Kinect scans you in, so you're being redrawn back. This is shot in daylight, so it's a bit hard for the exposure, but you're actually rescanned back in here as a drawing. So this is, no one's in this space right now, so it's just scanning the pixels right here, but your body's scanned back in and reprojected. So you're like kind of invited into this space. This is the code, what that code does. It actually, it'll scan your body in as pixels. It's my dog Porter, also known as Bort. And it draws you back in. So for me it was this kind of test in like, how can I think about distance from a lens? How can I think about directly representing something? It's an infrared scanner, so it's not thinking about color in the same way. No matter what the lighting conditions are, right, this will work. So the closer you are, the lighter the pixels, and the further away, the darker they are. And thinking about, well, how are we capturing information? How are we capturing data in the world? This was a really important step for me, I think, as a maker, because I'm moving from the question of like, okay, I gotta represent the fear of crashing on a bike. I know how to paint. To what if I try this? You know, maybe animation opens something up for me. And I'm like, okay, well, what if I brought a camera in? And I'm like, well, what if I start using a little code? And you just start getting on this like sliding scale, right? So like, at the time I'm seeing this all as like, okay, I'm just making these like moving paintings, you know, I'm making this stuff that's like, but with every material, with every project I'm making, I'm learning a little bit more, you know. So the making actually gave me this like big insight into like how making is a great way to learn stuff actually. You know, got really invested. I made a bunch of these big paintings in a similar way, trying to like compress this information, thinking about like form and counterform, thinking about my love for drawing and my love for like, you know, old master drawings and representing lines, and not wanting to like, being like, yeah, you know, I can do this too. We don't have to like just make idea art, you know, this is also ideas. I think I'm starting to open back up again to like, we have this sort of like play between things that we're taking objectively in the world, but also I was starting to see how important it was for me to be vocal about my own experience as a human, as a person, you know, and trying to figure out ways to mesh those together. So going back to a format like drawing, which really helped me, I was like, okay, drawing is direct, it's clear, I can get it. You know, drawing and code, very similar for me. You know, and I started to think about, okay, it is, you know, it's timeless. It's a kind of a great way to work through materials. Keeping an eye on time. At the time I was in Georgia, I was also working with 3 other artists, and we ran a community-based, it's like a very rough garage space that we painted pink to create this like halo effect in the community, to say like, all right, like nobody wants to go here, but we know cool people live here, and our studios are here, and we're going to open up our studios for the community to have people from the community show their own work in this space, and have them direct the programming with us, and we're just going to support whatever they want to put out on art night. And we had this whole thing too, which was like, you know, it was this kind of joke that I was like, you know, we had these like girls who were like, oh my gosh, can you believe it? You know, in this like sleepy southern town where everyone's like, can you believe, you know, Marianna's doing? Oh my gosh. Like, you know, it was like, come to art night. So it became this really lovely, we had this like unintended impact that we became like the official Instagram wall of like the entire region. But, you know, other than that, people came, they saw more art. So I think play has just been this really fun, play, relationships, building a community, so important to me. And it's really cool to see, like, as an artist, you know, we got a local grant to paint this, got it up with a couple friends in a day or two, and it really changed the whole space. It changed the block, you know. we gentrified the, no, I'm joking. We actually lost our studio space because someone bought it and we couldn't afford to keep it, so we got kicked out. Actually, that's really what happened. But then they painted it as like awful taupe, and then everyone in the city got mad and they repainted it pink, and I flew home and it was pink again, and I called Jason and I was like, did we get it back? And he was like, no, we just painted it. But, but you know, it's cool, like you have a voice, I think, as an artist, and I think we discount sometimes what a little bit of drawing or a little bit of painting can do, and how interactive and how performative that can be, and how inclusive that can be. So, you know, I'm thinking a little bit, okay, I'm thinking about identity, I'm thinking about these sort of cybernetic feedback loops. And the prefix cyber comes, you know, I'm thinking about these like patterns of information. There's a researcher, I believe it is Weiner in 1948, talking about the prefix for cyber being from like the Greek word for helmsman. So thinking about coding and early computer science is something that's allowing us to, we're both like directing our code. You're able to look at past actions or future and predict future actions. Thinking about machine learning a little bit, it's like AI, all this stuff's like a really hot topic right now. But I think there was something about it where the helmsman was for someone in order to steer the ship needs to correct the negative consequences of past actions, but also direct to make decisions about future actions. And I think, in a way, I started thinking about the boat. Also, I found these broken boats as one full boat. So these guys, it's 62 feet long. It's actually a boat that I raced. I was on the city rowing team in high school. It wasn't fancy. It was just like a city club thing. So they were throwing it in the trash. It was like this broken boat, and I was, you know, in my hometown, and I was like, oh my gosh, what are you doing with Patsy? That's our 8 boat, you know. And you know, I've been making this work on boats and about water, and thinking about water as this like metaphor for how we see ourselves. And I went and sawed Patsy up with a sawzall and a mask. So you know, sawed Patsy up. You know, took her back to my studio. And I was like, there's something about this boat that like is supposed to hold us up on water, but it's actually gonna sink. You know, this boat is broken. I found this bird's nest in there. There's like these petrified mummy baby birds because this thing had been just like discarded. I'm like, this is like the deepest loss. This is awful. And I was like, well, I'm gonna strip all the footboards and make a sound piece for it. So I made this like 8-channel sound piece where you would walk by the footboards and hear each different voice from each of the different rowers in the boat, and then those would sync back together and link up to a video. So there's a projector actually, and here are just sort of process shots. The other idea is that I hand poured all this sand, sort of create this like, sort of like thinking about like the journeys that we're taking to find ourselves, but also the impermanence of life as we're passing through time. You know, thinking about like, okay, we're making all these gestures, we're trying to figure out like, you know, how we're navigating what grows from loss. You know, what voice we still have after all of this thing. You know, I think in a way this was sort of this experimental, like material study really. Thinking about how can I, you know, now that I've gone this far in media, how can I reincorporate it back into the way that we see things? How can I make it more visual? How can I think about craft a little bit more? How can I think about the structures and how we're building these things? You know, really important for me to take the water out of it for a second. People have this like big desire to touch sand when it's like this. So I put this glass bowl here so that you could like freely play with any sand you wanted in this little bowl. And you know, but you just don't touch this one. And then it also became this like great social experiment. Took like, I poured this fistful by fistful. It took me 3 weeks to pour all this sand. And I was in there, like, I should have documented it as a performance. But I've actually got, I show in Atlanta, the Atlanta Contemporary this coming January, kind of dealing with a lot of these issues. So, you know, when I was making this installation, I was working with the curators and I was like, I'm gonna show you some ideas think about this as my sketchbook, think about this as a process, think about this as something, as a proof of concept for something bigger, you know? So thinking about when we're making work in studio, how do we use it to make the next work? How do we use all of these, you know, in a way, the coding and the tech stuff is integral to it, but you can see the feedback loop a little bit, and it's also not the most important part. The most important part is about sort of like, you know, this sustained growth and loss, is sort of like, you know, the conversations happening with the foot pedals, you know, the idea of the boats, wabi-sabi, of like a broken thing that's been made whole again. You know, again, I could talk a little bit further about that. It's super, some other like queer narratives in that as well, about my own experience. It's more personal, and happy to talk more later about it, but I want to just get through things. But, you know, I want to show a lot about this in terms of thinking about like, just being fearless, like trying stuff, failing, you know, trying it again, trying something else, switching materials in and out, finding the right tool for the job, basically. Maybe this is my upbringing speaking. So I poured the sand and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's gotta be a better way. So this is actually like a script I wrote for sand. I'm thinking, well, how can I bring environmental things? How can I bring these actual systems, these actual forces back into the studio? And thinking about, this takes like 10 minutes, 15 minutes to fill back up and make a black square. So it reminds me either of like those graphite drawings you make in art school, where they like make one perfect gradient. And you're like, okay, and you like press down too hard and it's over. You have to start again, you know? Or, you know, it's like, I can also think about this in terms of like, if I can simulate how wind might work, or if I can use this data from the environment to think about, you know, how sand might fall, how these very simple processes in the physical world are happening. If I can represent those virtually, then maybe I can apply those to images in a different way, in a more interesting way. You know, at the same time I'm thinking about, well, what if the drawings I was making, what if they were metal, you know? And I cut these out, these are water jet cut panels. I was like, well, if I project, these are 42 inches wide, because that's the width of my truck, and yeah, and that's just a practical thing. They're aluminum, so you know, you can also think about, I was thinking a lot about like facades for buildings, and thinking about, okay, projection, shadows, these sort of like elemental, the material itself, you know, how long is this gonna last over time? You know, the last thing I made, you know, disintegrated itself. So maybe this will be better. But there's obviously more to it. I welded out this steel basin to hold some water. It's watertight. And then I started thinking about that data, and I was like, okay, that's the sand script plus an infrared scanner on the left on a hike. So thinking about, okay, can I capture an image without a camera? Can I capture something like drawing with code, basically? Can I, you know, build these devices that are going to be body extenders, or which are going to extend my senses in a way? That similar conversation I had when I was thinking about, well, if I translate this from one sense to the other, you know, on the right, you know, I'm still kind of going through that dark time. I'm kind of like, you know, my father passed away. I was like, well, how can I, you know, start to layer stop motion maybe into that, go back and look backwards, you know, and thinking about, this is an installation for a space in Palazzo Bimbo from this year's exhibition, auxiliary shows, the 59th Venice Biennale. So this is sort of sponsored by the European Cultural Center. There's the aluminum panels and this animation. Back on. So thinking about, you know, almost collaging these elements together, and thinking about playing things, the stop motion, playing everything blooming backwards in a way, wanting to look back, wanting to like, you know, test things out. This is more field recordings, you know, a heartbeat. it's just something where I was like, well, let's see where this takes us, where the next one takes us. Like, I think in a way I was like, okay, I need to start and I need to readdress that Arctic footage. I need to go back and encounter those things that now that I've made work in different ways in the studio, thinking about process, thinking about, not an image as some fixed point as like a moment in time, but something that can also, we can grow from, we can change. I was like, I need to go to the desert. I need to look at the opposite of that project. And maybe by comparing my work in the desert, thinking about this loss, thinking about growth, thinking about where we're at, looking at that and juxtaposing that with the work in the Arctic, I can create a conversation between me 8 to 9 years later, me 8 to 9 years before. So, the desert's kind of wonky. I went all around this summer, and I found all these crazy, like crazy things. Truly, we're about wrapping up. Anyway, but actually finding that there's just actually a lot of sand, in the desert, which you would think, right? But it's actually cool, thinking about taking these tools back. A lot of these are process, like, quick sketches, thinking about sketching the format that I want to make the final output in, climbing up and exploring and jumping around places. I'm gonna go back this coming summer with a better camera, because I realized, even though I thought I knew exactly what I was doing, there's things I missed. So that's the nature of studio, I guess. That's how I continue making work. Thinking about also like 3D models and thinking about details. So this is for that Atlanta space. Blocking things out as like basic primitives and not really thinking about like too much detail. Thinking about having a projection that's stitched seamlessly 4 ways, like spherical projection. Thinking also about like how do we direct people through space and around space. So looking back at that architectural work, those collaborations, thinking about our light sources, it's an LED light. I was like, well, gravel and the LED together will work really well. So I think I'm spending a lot of time right now thinking about the materials that I'm using, not just about the tech stuff, but about like, how does the material support this idea? In a way, I'm like, it's like you jump this way and you jump that way and you realize, oh my gosh, it's really important, and you have to like go back and, spending a lot of time thinking about how stuff is built at the moment. But also thinking about how it's built to support that idea, to support the videos. And I'm just being quite quick. This is milled out. This is data from Mars, milled out on CNC. It's topographical data, some images from the rover. So for my sketchbook, it's feel like a sketchbook spread for me. Anyway, I don't leave time for questions, but this desert project is still happening. Working on, yeah. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
So throughout, and the way that you introduced us to starting to work in the Arctic, you have talked a lot about laws, and it seems like, I guess, I don't know exactly what the question is here, but like, I'm connecting that to, in particular, you had that, the piece where you wrote the glitch for the video from the Arctic.
Oh yeah.
And also the sand piece where you, like painstakingly made that like natural looking ripple pattern, but that you didn't want people to touch it. And then I'm connecting, you didn't want that, like the artifact of other people's fingers in there. And it seems like there's a little bit, I'm wondering about that thought process.
Yeah.
And then, but I'm connecting that somehow also to the piece where you made that glitchy sort of video animation image, but then you said that you were photorealistically filling in the edges because the program, you couldn't write the
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah,
But
that's one.
yeah, it seems like there's a little bit of overlap there. Like there's like the photo real painstaking like hand process, and wanting things to be glitchy and carrying like the imprint of where they've been.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this.
Yeah.
So I think for me, it's really so that when I'm talking about the helmsman, the cybernetic feedback, thinking about, when I first, let me also preface this with talking about our like family tree. You know, when I was like a kid, you know, I saw photorealism in that kind of like painting, and then I saw Robert Longo, and I saw like people like too close. And in high school, I was like, wow, like that's crazy. You know, like I have different opinions. Obviously, we grow, our tastes change, you know. But you know, I had this real appreciation for like old drawing, and like, you know, these ideas I grew up with about the culture, like the ways that images worked in my culture in the South. You know, with storytelling, with you know, representation and imagery, a lot of imagery. You know, and then I had this other sort of encounter growing up with the landscape and these things that we couldn't directly visualize, but which I knew were there. You know, so I'm thinking about the cybernetic stuff is like, when I was growing up, I was like, well, a system maybe is more objective. You know, maybe I could look at the world through a lens that's external to myself, you know, without my own agency, and that will be an authority. But then the more you find, the more you start scanning and looking and measuring the world, simulating it, the more you realize that you're really making a lot of decisions along this research process. You know, there's a lot of ways you can interpret data. And then I was also like, part of me too was like, I love drawing so much, and I wanted to draw. And I was like, I can do that as an artist, you know? So I was like, well, you know, there's this kind of play between like my tensions around wanting to make something that was an objective index of sight, so like smoke is an index of fire, or like, you know, any kind of evidence of something, but also this idea that like I have a positionality in this. I'm an individual maker. You know, I also have feelings and opinions about it. Whether I like it or not, you know, it's from my vantage point. I don't quite have the answer to this question in terms of like, you know, what's at stake in the image. And I think that's something that I'm continuing to like read about and look into. There's a great book by Melissa Gronlund called Contemporary Art and Digital Culture. Highly recommend if you're really interested in this. There's also a great book called I'm reading The Digital Plenitude by David Bolter. It's super good. You know, talking about like sort of representations, images. But you know, I like the idea of like control. In some areas it's practical because of the structure of the sand. Like underneath that, the way that I built the structure was actually like a rippled sculpture underneath it, and then a very thin layer of sand. So it's the illusion that it's lots and lots of sand, but to maintain the weight, and so the gallery would let me do it, I had to build that structure. So in a way I'm building this like, it's also something I showed in my painting practice, building like really precise things that mimic this other stuff that seems quite loose, but they're actually really precise. And I'm like, that's a thing I'm having a thing with, you know? I think part of it, you could analyze it on like a psychoanalytical level too, and be like, it's hard to be vulnerable sometimes. Like I wonder if there's that like control thing where you're like, I, you know, could talk about, you know, I say a lot of this stuff is like based on the environment, but a lot of this stuff when I talk about loss, I'm, you know, talking about the journeys that we take to find ourselves, and like, well, there's a moment where some of this data was coming from, I built these radio receivers from telephone pickups, and I was connecting them to like my headphones into a Zoom recorder. So walking around the place that I grew up, because I had spent so much time away, like, you know, my family is like quite homophobic. My community that I had so much support from growing up, so many good memories from. I was like, well, I'm an alien to that. I'm not part of that anymore. How do I find home? How do I navigate this? And I was like, maybe I have assumptions about it that, you know, are preventing me from really seeing it for what it is. So if I, again, shift my senses, I scan the electromagnetic spectrum and then look at that data, and and then look at it, maybe I'll see, and maybe I'll map my own home in a different way. It's always like this sort of like, well, maybe there's this like issue of like, I want it to be a certain way, you know, or like I have this like idealistic, like I wish that, you know, my community was like super, like, but also this idea that like, it's like this externalization of, through the tool, maybe, as like a way to be like, I can go and I can enter it as far as I need to, and then to the point of like, maybe it's a safety thing too. I don't know. It's really interesting. I need to think about it. Yeah.
I want to be mindful of the time too with
Sure.
Molly. Sorry, Molly. Trying to figure out how to formulate the question, but you know how sometimes it's with the performance art, let's say, right? And you brought this up earlier. Is the piece only the performance when you experience it, or is the piece the documentation
Oh yeah.
of the piece? I think that with your work, there's so much about the piece that is the research component. It is the making of it. It is so in a sense, I feel like in some ways I'm getting more of the piece having heard you speak about the piece than if I just experienced it differently if I was in the space. I guess what I'm saying is, how do you sort of, how do you contextualize that within sort of an exhibition kind of modality?
Oh, totally.
Does that make
It's a
sense?
great question. It's a great question too for like if anyone's making process-driven work, or if anyone's, there's a big artist of influence of mine is I love Wally Rod. I love Keith Cyril. You know, thinking about performance as something where it's like as like a material, like a medium in it. I think I wish I could show the work I'm working on now in this slideshow, because I think I'm addressing this directly in the piece for Atlanta, and I'm more actively in the work, because I realized for a long time, you know, in this I was like, I can't be in the piece because my orientation to making was always like, gotta make a representation of something,
Right.
you know. And then when I started making this letters piece, this guy, I was like, okay, I can talk about stuff. You can be in it, you can be scanned in it, you know. And now I'm at this point where I'm like, well, I think there's so much to be said about the stories that we tell, and sort of like how stories represent who we are, you know, and how we know ourselves, you know. They also represent how we can connect, you know, to others, like the ways that we're imperfect, the ways we tell stories. Yeah.
So you mentioned sketching a lot, and I noticed like you showed at the beginning of how it started, where you were, and then how it ends up. Are you consistently sketching like from each step, or is it usually just like the beginning for you, or is it like something that you keep going back to during a project?
I can kind of like synthesize these two questions and like finish this one. Yeah, so sketching and performance, all of these, you know, I think the big question for me is seeking and sketching in a material that supports the final outcome. You know, it's kind of like, if I'm making something interactive, maybe I use code, or maybe I do performance, or maybe I do something like that. I think I didn't realize how, you know, I'm always thinking about like who has a voice in this, and I never let myself have a voice in my own work, you know, it seems, until much later. So I'm like, well, I can speak to these things. Maybe this is a way of showing something in the work that I'm always thinking about sketching, or thinking about performance, thinking about the documentation of something as how can I let the viewer know something about the work that they wouldn't otherwise see. You know, I think about the artist statement in some way as a form of sketching, you know, as a way of like, these are things that I'm thinking about that frame this work, that frame, whether you're sketching on paper, writing about it, these are ways of seeing, you know, that open us up to these relationships, you know, between the work and between ourselves. So, you know, for me, I think that gap has been closing significantly over time, and you know, I think that they're now becoming more integrated, where like performance, where I'm like, okay, I love this stuff's really exciting for me to talk about, and the piece itself, you know, I think there's always ways that we can critique our work. Critique for me shows wants in the piece. It shows like, okay, where can I move forward with that? Where can I, in the sketch, sometimes like, I just always, like, I think making work for me keeps me alive. It kind of like keeps me going, you know, so I'm like, I need to be constantly figuring out, I think it's important to have these like daily rituals, you know, I like to do something creative every day. You know, maybe that's my cyclist brain. I don't know. Yeah.
Were your expeditions funded or aided by any like institutions or firms, or was it by yourself?
Yeah, they've all been funded by other institutions. So I've for the Arctic, it was Danish Arts Council. I had national. It was like a science. It was the residency itself was funded. So that was kind of like you applied to get in, part of the Arctic Circle. And then I've had community foundation grants. Grant writing is a thing I didn't talk too much about, but like I spent a huge amount of time writing grants and thinking about like how can I show that this is important. Some of the work was I did some work for like Berkshire Hathaway and for Shopcore Properties when I was in Philadelphia, and those sort of like public art-y kind of things funded other projects. But whenever like right now, I just got a grant for next summer for the desert, which is cool. I got a research fellowship for the first version of the desert, and then for camera equipment. This morning I was in a meeting, actually, I was like, I need a nicer camera because this project won't happen without it. You know, these are the things I need to do. Using 3D modeling to kind of show and sketch, you know, like, okay, getting people as close to that idea as possible, you know, with these tools that are open source, with using coding, using 3D modeling, using things like Shaper 3D, Tinkercad, and Ben was talking about, you know, using writing to help get someone there and help get you funding for your work in a huge way. Like, it's been so important. That said, the grant stuff, there's good local grants if you're interested in like getting things like that. You can always think about reaching out to. A lot of people just look at like National Endowment for the Arts. There's like ResArtis and like there's like other granting sites that you can look through and apply for. Public art calls, crowdsourcing. So I hope it's helpful. Happy to share links. Yeah, a question right there.
I was wondering like what I feel like you've explored like a lot of different like mediums and forms of art, which is really cool. Is there a different kind of medium or like way of working that you haven't yet tried out that you're interested in trying soon or at some point?
Oh yeah, I mean like I'm always, so my faculty position is emerging tech, like so any new thing I'm like, oh what is it? I don't know yet. I also took the Enneagram test, I'm a 5, so I kind of just need to know, I think. I not that I believe in that, but I thought it was funny. You know, I think in terms of tech, like right now, I'm really stoked on this like 3D projection stuff. Figured out how to stitch. So a lot of the footage I took in the desert was like specifically like data forward or like sort of these like pieces of video stitched together, almost like a video textile. And then I'm working on like wrapping them as a sphere, basically, and wrapping them into other sculptural forms. And then thinking about the ways that your body moves through space. But also in the work for the show, thinking about like Ben's question, performance and where am I in the work and how does storytelling directly come into the work. So having this like fusion of, for me the new thing to explore isn't necessarily like a tech thing. It's not about like the magic of like the surface part. It's more about like, well, the new thing I'm exploring is like all this content, you know, around storytelling and around like who, you know, okay, who makes stuff and what does it mean, you know, and why is it important? And that's really, and like what materials support that, material evidence of that. So, reading a really great joinery book by Tage Fried. So, you know.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, it's really great. Yeah.
all depart, I'd like to give Molly from the museum